better never ends. In health, in performance, no matter your starting point, you can always strive for better. My name's Charlie Goodchild, I'm your host, and this is the Better Never Ends podcast. We've made it our mission to share with you the expertise and wisdom of role models and leading experts in their field, teaching us about how we can be better, telling stories about their journey to better, and inspiring you to discover yours.
Good afternoon, Marjolein Dutry van Haeften. How did I do?
That was really good.
Yeah, okay, well I have been practicing that a lot, so I'm glad it's close enough, although no doubt you're being kind. So today we're here talking about women's health and specifically around hormones. And your business brand is Hormoniously, which I love, by the way, a very good play on words.
Thanks.
And I think to get us started, it'd be great to hear why you're so passionate about this, and with a particular focus on your journey, what's brought you to where you are today and why that might be so relevant to our conversation. Over to you.
Well, like many nutritional therapists, I'm here due to my own ill health. Okay. So my origin story is around how I found the tools to get to where I am now. And I think it was in my mid-20s, I started having a lot of symptoms that I realised weren't normal. And I kept going to my GP for support. And I was lucky, they did run tests and things like that, but they kept just telling me, oh, all your results are normal, there's nothing wrong with you. But I was 27 and I felt like an 87-year-old. Mm. I remember walking home from the supermarket one day, and it was a 10-minute walk. And I had to stop and sit on one of my neighbour's garden walls because I was so exhausted that I couldn't do the full walk home. And I just knew that it wasn't acceptable to have that level of ill health, I suppose. Yeah. And looking back, I can see that what was happening to me at the time is I was burnt out. Mm-hmm. I'd had a couple of really stressful jobs and I'd really struggled through those. And I kept telling myself, I'll leave this and then all the symptoms will go away. Yeah. But as we know, that's not how the body works, unfortunately. It had already adapted to the level of stress. And the second job I left, and I spent, I think, 4 weeks or something where I just barely got out of bed, and I was really depressed and had really low energy and just thought, what am I going to do? And one of the modalities I turned to was nutrition. And I went to see a nutritionist and I got really good results at first, and then it plateaued. And essentially, I agreed with some of her principles, but she'd put me on various quite strict protocols and a lot of removing things. Okay. And they'd said, here's some foods that you should avoid, but don't get obsessed with it. And I didn't have any follow-ups after that. Okay. And I became obsessed with the foods that I could and I couldn't have. Yeah. And because I saw improvements, I had less fatigue, I was less ill. I think in the space of a year, the problems I was seeing were I had chest infections, I had 2 kidney infections. These were the kind of things that were happening to me, as well as the fatigue. So seeing her, I saw a dramatic improvement in my health, but I still had issues with energy and things like that. But ultimately, I'd then become obsessed with good and bad foods, and that was a really unhealthy mindset. And I thought, I love this modality. I can really see it helping people, but it needs to be delivered in a more balanced way with a lot more support. Yeah. So I decided to become a nutritional therapist. Okay. And I think in my second year, we were doing the women's health lecture, and I had such a light bulb moment where we were learning about endometriosis, and I was like, oh, so fainting from pain regularly and throwing up is in fact not a normal symptom that the GP told me I needed more painkillers for. Yeah. And that was when I knew that my focus was going to be around women's health. Mm-hmm. So essentially, my driver is I want people to feel less alone on their journey, because between me, sitting on that garden wall, being exhausted and not knowing what was wrong with me, to me realising I had endometriosis and pushing for a diagnosis, that was a 3-year time span. So that is my mission, is to make sure that we know there's another way, we know there's support, even when your GP has written you off, told you you're fine. it's giving people the support they need to keep looking for solutions to feel better.
And endometriosis, how would a woman know that she might have endometriosis?
So the really common symptoms are heavy cycles, a lot of pain around cycles, fatigue, low mood, pain with bowel movements, pain during sex, pain. Sometimes some people have pain, like bladder pain, so pain when they're urinating. It's a lot of pain across the board. But some people don't have any symptoms, and the way they find out is they might be, trying to have a baby, and they're going through investigations with a medic, and then they find that the person has endometriosis and that it's, there's tissue that's blocking a fallopian tube or preventing an ovary from releasing an egg, for example. So that's why that's part of a fertility investigation. So partly it's, symptomatic on a day-to-day basis, but some people don't have any symptoms at all, and it's only through kind of investigations for another thing that they find out.
And what is it?
So it is a condition where tissue that is similar to the lining of the womb grows on other parts of the body. So often people will say it's a condition that's mainly affecting pelvic organs, but it's been found on the lungs, on the diaphragm. Somebody had endometrial-like tissue on their eye.
Wow.
In the brain. It's a whole body condition. It's lumped in as a hormonal condition, but it's ultimately also inflammatory. So there's something going on with the immune system, because normally if there's tissue growing somewhere where it shouldn't be, the immune system gets rid of it. So we've got immune dysfunction, we've got flare-ups during particular points of the menstrual cycle, we've got a lot of pain, which is then causing problems with the stress response. So when I think back to, me burning out in my 20s, having this underlying chronic pain condition was a huge driver for that.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of other people out there like me who have these symptoms, have been told they're normal, and just don't know that they could be pushing for a further diagnosis.
And how do they do that? Is it just a case of keep asking the questions, keep knocking on the GP's door, or do they maybe look somewhere else?
They can look elsewhere, but ultimately it's a condition that has to be diagnosed medically.
Yeah.
So what I normally say, I have quite a few clients that have to ask them to change GPs. If it's really disempowering and it's really invalidating to have a doctor say there's nothing wrong with you when you know so deeply in your core that there is a problem and you shouldn't have to put up with all of this stuff. So it might be a case of switching a GP, asking for a second opinion. One of the main issues is that the way it's diagnosed, endometriosis specifically, is through a laparoscopic surgery. So I had symptoms of severe pain from when I was 16, and my diagnosis when I was 30. So that's 14 years of symptoms. And one of those reasons is because if a teenager goes to a GP and the first port of call to find out if you've got endometriosis would be surgery, that's not a reasonable thing to do. So I completely understand that you'd need to rule out other conditions, but there is a really big habit in the medical approach to women's health of saying, oh, this is due to hormones, let's shut down the hormones, and then the problem is gone. But ultimately what we want to know is root cause, what's going on in the body and what's driving those symptoms, and then we can try and make, lifestyle recommendations, look at supplementation and food changes that can help to positively influence those symptoms.
And I guess this is what you were saying earlier, is that for your journey, the nutritional changes did help, but actually there was a big chunk of other stuff that didn't quite get you all the way.
The stress response was a big factor for me.
Yeah, okay.
It was a really big factor, yeah.
And tell us then about that. What you've said already, there was a couple of times where you were clearly very stressed with work and that was causing its own symptoms. What was it for you that helped you get control of that? Or what were the triggers perhaps?
There's a really clear moment that I remember, and I share this a lot with clients and when I'm presenting, but basically I was one of the final weekends of my lectures when I was studying to become a nutritional therapist, and it was a Saturday morning, it was a beautiful day, the sky was blue, everyone was, when it's good weather in London and the vibe is great. It was that. And I was like, oh, yay, really interesting lectures, really excited. Got on the bus I was living in East London, got on the bus. And halfway through, maybe not even halfway through the journey, I started getting this like creeping heat in the base of my spine, and it kind of creeps up your back. And then for me at the time, it kind of felt like claws that then go around your abdomen, and it's dull and sharp at the same time. It's quite difficult to describe. And then you start sweating bullets, and I was shifting around uncomfortably in my seat, and I was trying to get comfortable, and the guy on the bus next to me was just giving me like weird side eye, kind of, what is this woman doing? But I realized, oh my gosh, it's period pains. And I thought, I have to get off this bus. And it took me a few stops to kind of summon up the strength to pick up my bag, which suddenly felt like it was filled with rocks. I managed to pick it up and then made my way off the bus, like wobbly knees. I'd sat on the top deck. Don't know, it was a really bad decision. Wobbly knees coming down the stairs, and made it off the bus. And it was one of those bus stops that only has a little prop seat, you know, the really skinny ones, not a full seat. So I propped myself there, and then I literally slumped over double because the pain had fully kicked in. And there were all these lycra-clad, healthy-looking people heading to brunch and sports clubs is what I was going to say, you know, yoga or spinning, that kind of vibe in Clerkenwell. And in the middle of all that, I was slumped over, sweating, pasty. No one stopped to ask me if I was okay, and they were giving me quite a wide berth, like probably thought I was
it's a bit early in the day for that.
Out from the night before. And I was there for 45 minutes before I could get the strength to get my phone out of my bag and call my partner at the time, who drove to come and pick me up and took me home, and I slept it off. But that I must have been 32. So I'd had surgery at 30 to remove excess tissue, and I'd made loads of dietary changes. So I had a really quote unquote healthy diet. And I was like, why am I still having these issues? I don't understand. I've worked so hard for this. But the problem was I was working full time and studying. So I was burning the candle at both ends, except neither was a fun end. Yeah. So it was,
there's no outlet.
Exactly. And even if there were an outlet, a lot of the outlets that we choose are not great for our health.
Burning the candle at the other end, the third end.
Exactly. One of those like religious candles. So my problem there was stress, and I think that was the realization. Okay. And, you know, a couple of months after that wasn't quite enough for me to do something about it. A couple of months after that, I had to go to the GP because I'd managed to have a panic attack. And I went to speak to the GP, and he made me do the GAD questionnaire, and he was like, yeah, you've got moderate depression and anxiety. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I'm just a bit stressed. But I wasn't taking it seriously enough. And that was ultimately, the stress response is such a huge driver for hormonal issues, that for me, I'd made lots of other changes and I hadn't been serious enough on interventions for that.
Yeah, this is something. So I work a lot with people with persistent chronic pain, and my understanding has evolved in the last few years based on some really good stuff that comes out of Australia, the kind of Explain Pain group. They're really good. And I remember them talking about the fact the immune system is intertwined with the neurological system. So it's not like they are two separate systems.
Yeah.
And it's not like they react off each other separately. They are literally the same thing. They are in the same synapses. They're in the same areas. So there's an immune cell and there's a neural cell. They're right next to each other. So if one is affected, the other is then affected. And whichever the causation is, it doesn't really matter. They're both going to be upregulated. So that sounds like that's kind of what's going on there. They're both causing each other and having an impact on health.
Yeah, it's one of those vicious cycle scenarios. And I think another big issue is, you know, when we are in pain, the body releases cortisol because cortisol dampens pain. That's why people are often given cortisone steroids for pain relief, or corticosteroids. So even if we aren't in this mental stress response, we've got a physical stress response going on. And I think that's something that's really important to differentiate for my clients as well, is we are so used to running at a constant baseline level of stress that what we perceive as stress is severe stress.
Yeah.
And so I like to remind people that there are psychological stressors, emotional stressors, physical stressors, and physiological stressors. So when we think about the physiological ones, it could be, you've got an injury or inflammation in the body, the microbiome can be a factor there. But also dehydration and nutrient deficiencies, which ultimately technically are easy to fix. But we need to know that that's a big priority. So what I struggle with is if people come to me and they know they don't drink enough water, and I'm like, it's such an easy one to make sure that we make a change doing that, but it's difficult to be strict with it. But it has a huge impact on our stress response.
Yeah, and you were saying earlier again about your story, and that you probably physiologically dealt with a lot of it through the nutrition, but then there's these other factors that needed addressing too. And fundamentally, the GP and probably the NHS in general doesn't have the resources or the knowledge or maybe even the inclination to really fully explore those and help women that are suffering. And one of the points I think is that ultimately research for decades and decades and decades has been very male focused, and so is the world of medicine as well. There are obviously women in that field, but very male dominated in that world. So ultimately, do you think it's a bit of a problem of essentially women in a man's world in that kind of medical researchy sense? There's still a bit of a catch up that's going on.
It's women in a man's world in many senses, yeah. So even if we think about it from a professional sense, the working day, like 9 to 5 working and doing the same thing throughout the whole month, men have this daily 24-hour testosterone rhythm, whereas women have this monthly cycle. And we are talking about it a lot more. But exactly like you say, the medical research for years, women weren't part of studies because it was, they were so worried about having negative impacts of, drug trials and things like that. But what it meant is that it really puts the hormone cycle and the menstrual cycle in this little black box that no one will look at. They'll be like, oh, we can't possibly influence those hormones because we don't know what will happen. But then you'll never know what will happen. Yeah. And it's things like dosages of certain drugs and things like that. But for example, with endometriosis, it takes on average of 8 years in the UK between first having symptoms and mentioning it to your doctor to getting a diagnosis. And part of that is because if surgery is the only way to truly diagnose it, that's the gold standard, then it's not something that's going to be done quickly. And waiting lists are just getting longer and longer as well. So there are more studies into it now and looking at other ways of diagnosing it. For example, looking at certain markers in, for example, menstrual blood. There's a study looking at that as a possible diagnosis method. There was recently some research that came out around the impact of bacteria, so the microbiome, on endometriosis, which is really encouraging. But also what you then see on, for example, social media is it gets really overly simplified, and it's like endometriosis is caused by bacteria. Yeah. It's not. It's very multifactorial. Yeah. It's something that's contributing, but it's absolutely not the blanket statement that is the answer. And I think what you mentioned earlier about possibly the NHS limitations is because it's so multifactorial, what you want is working on the stress response, working on the immune system, working on the microbiome, which we know the NHS is not there. They don't, people are put on antibiotics. They're not even recommended a course of probiotics afterwards, like they are in a lot of other countries. You also want help with physical support. So pelvic health physios, for example, are really wonderful to work with someone in endometriosis, because if you have a lot of pain in, abdominal pain, your muscles start to react in different ways, and you can also start to anticipate pain as well. And so you can end up with a lot of really tight structural things going on.
Well, the modern pain science suggests that pain is a predictive concept or a predictive mechanism. So it's based on your previous experiences and your brain's best guess and protecting you. So it's predicting the future and therefore going into tension before anything has necessarily even happened. But it's saying around this time of the month, things are going to change. So let's tighten right up. And then it's getting into that protective state.
Yeah, which makes sense because, we learn from our previous experience. And one of the main things that I work on with my clients as well is mindset. But if you say that without explaining what you mean by it, people can make quite negative assumptions, because I'm not saying you are ill because of your mindset.
It's all in your brain. It's all in your mind, right?
That's my least favourite. That I was told, psychosomatic. Yeah. However, we cannot ignore the role that our brain and our thoughts play. And quite often I do refer on to, counselling, because it's really helpful. Because our mental health is such a huge player as well. And it's, I'm going to say bidirectional, but it's way more than bidirectional. But if we think about it, there's physiological things that can contribute to mood issues. But there are also, thoughts, feelings, and how we do or don't process them that can then influence the physical as well.
Yeah. Well, think how you feel after a hangover, for example.
I don't remember because it's been a while.
But it certainly is something that's not too far in my past. And you're just a bit grumpy, and for a day, maybe two, because physiologically, it has an impact.
Yeah.
And actually, you were saying about your thoughts and feelings as well. Think how you are when you've gone through trauma or gone through bereavement or something like that. Yeah. It takes a long time for that to settle back down into your normal, because it has a physiological response. Your thoughts and feelings have a physiological response on your body. Yeah, exactly.
On the hangover thing, I actually had to stop drinking because my hangovers were so bad.
Wow. And is that part of the symptoms?
Well, it was severe anxiety. Mm-hmm. My mental health was horrible. But yes, if you have issues with estrogen and estrogen detox, then alcohol is broken down those same pathways, and so it can exacerbate symptoms. It also messes around a lot with your blood glucose regulation, and a lot of women with hormone issues have issues with blood glucose as well, because again, it's part of the hormone system.
Mm-hmm. And what impact might that have on their day-to-day, having an impact on the blood glucose?
This is one of my favourite things to work with clients, because if you have dysregulated blood glucose, or either a really sensitive response to sugar, or your body is in it starts to move towards pre-diabetes, you can have a lot of symptoms around mood changes. So feeling really snappy, feeling really angry, and then feeling bad about that afterwards.
So this is hangry. This is the hangry concept. Are we allowed to say that?
I say it a lot, hangry.
We can say hangxiety and hangry.
Yeah, but anxiety is hangovers and hangry is hunger. It's different, but yeah.
We're making up words as we go.
Exactly. That is the way. Isn't that what all good, alternative health people do? So if you're having a lot of energy shifts as well, so you feel suddenly really tired in the afternoon, and you really feel like you need a pick-me-up, so either food or caffeine, or you're frequently turning to food to help you to get through the day. Also, another symptom can be poor sleep. So obviously not when it's like really hot and clammy, because that's probably what's affecting your sleep. But if you're someone who you always wake up at 3 a.m. on the dot, that could be a sign that your body is waking you up because your blood glucose has dropped too low, and you're not having that healthy breakdown of tissue from the liver, or stored sugar in the liver, that's bringing your blood sugar back up to keep you asleep at night. And so your body releases cortisol in the night. And a lot of people start to have those kind of symptoms, and they might mention it to me but not really think there's much to do about it, because they're so normalized. I think that's another issue, is a lot of symptoms people have are experienced by so many people that we are told they're normal, but just because something has been normalized doesn't mean it's something you have to put up with. And I always think about the systems in the body as a hierarchy. So people will come to me because they're worried that they've got issues with estrogen and progesterone, for example. So that sits right at the top of this hormone pyramid in my head. So it's the cherry on top. Yep. But it's influenced by the lower bases of the pyramid. And so under the estrogen and progesterone, you've got your thyroid. And then under that, you've got your stress response. And then underpinning it, you've got your blood glucose. So if your blood glucose is out of whack, or your blood glucose response, what happens when it drops too low is your body releases cortisol. And that is one of our main stress hormones.
So you start heading up the pyramid.
Yeah, because the body thinks if the blood glucose drops too low that we're in danger. And it's like, oh my gosh, we must be in a famine. Quickly release some sugar so that, we can do stuff. But cortisol doesn't just release sugar. It also has all this other stress impacts.
Especially if it's on sustainably, because ultimately it's a good thing in the short term. I read this amazing book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky.
Yes.
It's an incredible book. And it ultimately says that zebras only have this cortisol release when they need it. Yeah. And unfortunately, one of the negative sides of being humans is that we have this ability to create stuff in our head and ruminate and think. And I mean, it's both good and bad for obvious reasons. And one of the bad reasons is that we can switch our stress response on and keep it on. And that gradually over time goes from being a positive thing into a negative thing. And that's part of what we're talking about here, isn't it? That sustained on switch, but not really on, but just on enough
on at the right times as well.
Or the wrong times.
Or at the wrong times,
yeah.
But with, cortisol has loads of great, it's really important in the body. It gets us out of bed in the morning. And looking at that 24-hour cortisol cycle is really helpful to see, are you within the right ranges? Are you someone who you produce loads in the morning and then suddenly in the afternoon you can barely get through the day? And then we can consider, is it your stress response, or is it because your blood glucose is completely out of whack, for example? And then stress has a big impact on the thyroid, and the thyroid has a big impact on estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone.
So would you say then, given that what you're saying around that pyramid is that first things first, deal with the foundation, deal with that blood glucose. That would be the first thing to investigate, try to change, for example.
Yeah. So for some people, controversially, I'm going to counter my own pyramid, but for some people, blood glucose sits at the very bottom, and for some people, stress. Okay. So it's also kind of weighing up for the individual, what are your priorities and what is the most important thing for you to change? Because a lot of the recommendations I give to people will benefit a lot of people, but it's also figuring out what is your top priority and what's going to make you feel better more quickly, plus what's going to be the easiest thing for you to sustain.
This is what I was about to ask, actually, because I was thinking in my practice as a physio, I'll sometimes think, what's the low-hanging fruit? What's the one that we're going to get the quickest bang for buck, where they'll go, yep, okay, I get it now. Get them on board, change something quickly, so they know that you know what you're doing and they feel better. If they feel better and they trust you, there's much more chance they'll do the hard stuff longer term.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also it's really important to give people the tools to know that they can then continue on their own. That ultimately is what I want for my clients. Is I do not want people to rely on me long term. I'm there to help them when they're really in crisis, and then I get them to a stage where they feel a lot better, and I'm like, great, you can do this on your own, and then come back to me periodically when you want to build on it. But ultimately, we also have to have a bit of a contingency plan for when all the wheels fall off. We mentioned when we're grieving, you might have a huge work issue or some sort of big thing going on in your personal life. What are the absolute basics to keep going? What do you really need to prioritize at that point? And what can you just let go of?
Flare-up plan, we call that in my world.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's nice. Yeah.
What's your flare-up plan? You spoke there about giving people the tools. What might some of those tools be? What are the most common things you tend to say to people?
So I work with various conditions. So we've touched on endometriosis already, but I also work with PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is where you have a huge mood shift in your luteal phase of your cycle, which is the time between ovulation and your period. And then I also work with PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and people who just don't feel like themselves and think it's hormone related. Yeah.
And this was sorry to interrupt, this was the bit where I read on your website about sometimes it's not good enough to just feel okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you mean there. And that could just be a real subtle feeling of just, I'm all right. Probably don't need to go to a doctor, but I don't know, just feel a bit okay.
One of my clients, she said, when I asked her what she felt the best about after we'd worked together, is she noticed differences in her mood. For a long time, she felt very steady but numb. And so she said, I felt really annoyed at work this week, but I felt good that I felt annoyed because I felt something.
Yeah.
And it's that as well. Quite often we're just kind of floating through life a bit numbly. And so it's kind of reconnecting and knowing that there's good and there's bad, but that's normal. You know, a third of the time we're going to feel good, a third of the time we're going to feel neutral, and a third of the time we're not going to feel good. Yeah. And it's figuring out what do those look and feel like for you. But so for my clients, absolute basics are making sure that they're eating balanced meals. So I've got this little meal planning document, which I will always send them off with after we finished. And it just reminds you to have protein, healthy carbs, and healthy fat with your meals. And also it's remembering that you can influence with each meal. I think quite often what we do is we write off a whole day. We're like, oh God, I had pizza for lunch. Like, I might as well just eat whatever I want for the rest of the day. I'm a big believer that people should be able to eat everything they want, but I also believe they need to prioritize getting all the nutrients they need. And then outside of that, they can eat anything they want. So often if we actually do make sure that we're meeting those like nutrient needs and having a good variety of vegetables, we're not going to want so much of the stuff.
Because of the fibre and the protein fills you up.
Yeah, it fills you up.
So you don't crave so many of the bad things.
Yeah, but also if someone has nutrient deficiencies, for example, their body is going to make them keep eating.
Because they're trying to get the nutrients.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, get some iron in.
Yeah,
like,
the body's trying to protect you, right?
Is there iron in Diet Coke? No, there's not, by the way. But yeah, so that's a big thing is eating balanced meals. Yeah. Another thing is making enough time for yourself. And everyone's like, why is my nutritionist telling me that? But ultimately, if we don't prioritize happy and joyful times for ourselves, what is the point in working on your health? Because otherwise you're just putting loads of effort in so that you can keep slogging out at a job that you may or may not care about. So it's really remembering what are the things that really light you up and knowing what is your goal, why are you doing this?
Yeah, what are your values? Why do you do what you do?
Yeah.
Is it for money? Is it for joy? Is it for pleasure? What are the things you do? Do you do it for your family? Do you do it for a sense of purpose? What is that purpose in your own life?
I had a client who she had a lot of issues with chronic pain and fatigue. And we started working together, I want to say March of this year, so not that long ago. And she just wrote to me because she spent a week in Paris with her daughter and she was doing 15,000 steps a day. And she just said, I can't believe I used to feel tired doing a grocery shop and I've been able to do this. So it's remembering that, it's knowing exactly that, why are you doing what you're doing? Because it's so worth it if you know why you are making lifestyle changes.
Yeah. And with a lot of these things, people are coming to you because they feel they need some help, and some people can help themselves for sure, but there is something in accountability, isn't there? Just having someone to work with, to lean on and to feel a sense of personal accountability, but perhaps even financial accountability. Sometimes that's just having a bit of skin in the game can be quite powerful, I find.
Absolutely. I've had people gift sessions to friends and family and they never get cashed in per se. The person never books in. And it's exactly as you say, sometimes you need to have skin in the game. You need to think, okay, I've spent a chunk of money. I need to do the work to see the payback, as it were.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think there's many ways to do accountability. And I think you and I had a chat about resources, and not everyone has the resources to see a physio or to see a nutritional therapist. And so if that's the case, what can you do? Because we know there's so much free information out there, but how do we make sure that we are implementing it, and how do we make sure that we can sustain it as well?
Yeah, because it doesn't have to be a clinician, does it? You had some good ideas around that. Yeah,
so kind of getting an accountability buddy, maybe someone who's going through a similar experience to you. But I think that can be really, really helpful.
And while we're on the subject, what kind of resources would you recommend people to learn from? I guess we're talking about a lot of stuff going on here. We've mentioned a few different subjects, but what might be some key things within your field that might help people?
There are some really fantastic books, which also I think one of the things is if you're suffering with fatigue, you don't want to sit there and read something that's going to require a lot of brain power, but knowing you can dip in and out of certain chapters and things like that. So one of my favourite books is by Dr. Lara Briden, and it's called The Period Repair Manual. And I absolutely love that, and I will quite often recommend that to clients because it's great. There are a few kind of podcast episodes that are really helpful as well. So there's a Huberman Lab one with Dr. Sarah Gottfried that's fairly recent, I think, last couple of months, and that talks through life stages as well, because we've not touched on this yet, but, you know, we talk about the menstrual cycle, but you've got what precedes that, and then, you know, the menstrual cycle, how long it takes to settle in to become regular. And then you've got perimenopause and menopause and beyond. So we've got life stages as well to consider. But so that was a great podcast episode. And those are two great resources. And in terms of finding, you know, if you do want to work with a clinician, making sure that they're registered with the Complementary Natural Healthcare Council and either BANT or AFN, because that means that they're required to do a certain number of CPD hours, so the professional development every year. And that it means that they work under a regulated authority. Yeah, and I know something that you do, which I think, you know, all clinicians would do well to offer, is that you offer a free session just to chat and just to get to know them, because the personality match is really important. You've got to connect with your clinician. Yeah. So having that ability to just get a feel for it, understand the processes, ask questions, I think that's really important. Yeah. So most people would offer that, I would expect, including yourself. There were a couple of other podcast episodes that I listened to recently on the Stephen Bartlett podcast. So I can't remember the guests, but we might put them in the show notes just to add a bit of extra information. That I think one was based on glucose and the Jessie. I think that was the glucose goddess.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, and there was another one as well that was very much talking about some of the concepts you were saying with the way the world is set up for men, ultimately, and just suggesting that the menstrual cycle does have an impact on the energy of women, the productivity of women, and having a more flexible working arrangement would be quite beneficial, and I'll put that one in there too. Yeah. Another one, if we're talking Stephen Bartlett, is the one he did with Tim Spector. Yes. Because that talks a lot about the gut, and I've said microbiome and how it can drive inflammation, but that can play a huge role in all of the conditions that I work with. Yeah. So because the gut can have an influence on mood, on pain, on your immune system, it's just so far reaching, the impact. Yeah, and the individualized concept of monitoring people's response to different foods is something I think is really, really powerful, and I think it's going to be a game changer in the future. Yeah. At the moment, it's probably not quite accessible for everyone. It's relatively expensive and quite hard to get hold of. But actually, in the future, I'm sure they'll have it on wearables and things like this. What they are doing is fascinating, though. The Zoe, because what we're talking about is the Zoe project. Yes. Yeah, they're essentially getting a study done by the participants paying for it. Yes. That's genius. It is genius. And the database they're going to have is going to be great. Complete game changer to understand food and our responses to food. I did ask them whether they were going to look at women's health in particular with that, and they did say they've written something around menopause already, or perimenopause. They're going to look at PCOS, so polycystic ovarian syndrome, but they don't have plans to look at endometriosis yet. So what I normally say, because I have people who've done that study and they come to me because they don't know what to do with the results, and it's a lot of information. It can be overwhelming, and it's great to look at generally what's happening. But if you have a diagnosed condition, you probably do want more targeted support than something like that intervention. So they do a microbiome test, and they do blood glucose monitoring, and they also do a blood spot to look at your lipids as well, I think. And you mentioned about perimenopause. Could we go into that a bit further, because this is something that I'm hearing a bit more as well in the media now, that people are much more outspoken about it. Celebrities are talking about their own experience of it. So what is that? What is that, firstly, and how might you look out for it proactively, and perhaps also reactively if you're feeling it? Yeah. So previously we would only use the word menopause, but technically menopause is 12 months after your last period.
that's it, that moment. And then the next day you're postmenopause. So it's really a really specific moment in time. Perimenopause is the time around that. So perimenopause can start from the age of 35 onwards. That doesn't mean that there's a sudden change. I think there's a lot of kind of scaremongering around, women in their mid-30s that suddenly your health drops off. That isn't what happens. But essentially most of your hormones are made by your ovaries and your womb. And then as you go through perimenopause, your hormone production shifts. So you can go through more estrogen surges, but also your ovulation becomes less frequent. And so you're quite often in a state of what we call estrogen dominance. That's when your progesterone production isn't quite in the right ratio to your estrogen. And then you can get a lot of symptoms like mood swings, water retention, headaches. There's a lot that you can experience. If you Google perimenopause symptoms, there's hundreds of symptoms, like over 100 symptoms. But basically, as these hormone changes are happening, as you move towards menopause, it's like your ovaries are handing over the baton to your adrenal glands. So your hormone production goes from your ovaries in your womb to your adrenals, which then don't produce anywhere near the levels of estrogen that we had before. So there's a lot of symptoms around estrogen withdrawal. But the thing with considering perimenopause is that women who have hormone symptoms from, like me, I started having symptoms when I was a teenager. If we get there and if we start supporting the teenagers and making sure that they've got healthy cycles and they know what to do, we're going to have a lot less issues with hugely problematic perimenopause symptoms. But that's more around preventative health. And as we've touched on, the healthcare model isn't really there. No. That's what we're here for. Yeah. But if you're going to look at the NHS or, whatever the healthcare provider is that you're using, it's not really preventative. And the huge impact that we can have with lifestyle, food supplements, it can start at a much earlier age. But in terms of some of the main perimenopause symptoms, it's period frequency changing. So you will possibly start having much shorter cycles. And by that, I mean the entire month cycle, not shorter periods. So previously you might have been having 30-day cycles. Suddenly you drop all the way down to 21. So it feels like your periods become a lot more frequent. Then what happens is you start missing periods. And when the gaps are less than 3 months, you're in the earlier stages of perimenopause, and when they're greater than 3 months, you're in the later stages. And then once you've got your 12 months since your last period, that's when you've hit menopause. But those are the kind of things that we look at. And I have a lot of clients who will say, I think I'm in perimenopause, but I went to my GP and they couldn't help me. They can't, because there's no interventions other than HRT. And HRT is there for when your estrogen is low. So if you're in the earlier stages, when your estrogen is surging, you don't want to be on HRT.
It's the wrong thing. It's pushing the wrong button.
It's going to push you into a higher state of this estrogen dominance, although you get progesterone as well from your GP. But so the intervention isn't there. So then the options really are lifestyle, but they're not yet widely offered on the NHS. Hopefully, I know a few nutritionists who work in certain practices, but it very much depends on, it's a bit of a postcode lottery, what is the support in your area.
Yeah, and we've spoken about a few of the different ways that you might change your lifestyle, which is looking at the fundamentals of your diet and trying to manage your stress response. Yeah, I don't think we've spoken much about exercise. Is that something that would fit into that remit as well?
Absolutely. And I talk a lot about exercise. I don't know a lot about exercise, but as in if I
signpost.
Exactly. I talk to the experts, and luckily there's loads here. Yeah. But basically, there's people who sometimes when we feel really stressed, we want to burn off that adrenaline. But if you're someone who's constantly going to loads of HIIT classes, that's not necessarily very good for your stress response. And so it's about getting a real mix of exercise. But the benefits in terms of hormones as well are, if you are someone who produces a lot of estrogen, or you have issues with your estrogen breakdown pathways, so the way your liver processes estrogen, getting it out through sweat is really helpful. So, exercise, saunas, things like that. There's loads of things you can do that can support that. So definitely finding an exercise method that works for you that isn't necessarily taxing on your stress response. And another thing is, if someone comes to me and they're really stressed and they've got a lot of hormonal issues and they're a long distance runner, that's often a really difficult topic, because you want to keep your body in a state, again, that doesn't push you into this stressed response. Otherwise your body thinks it like recruits, and it's like, we're in a famine, our exertion is more than we're taking in. And so again, it's all about those messages that you're sending your brain.
Yeah.
So yeah, we do talk about kind of modifying your exercise. And for people that don't exercise or feel that they don't have time, really finding out how to find a form that they love, and actually for them to prioritize it, because it's really important.
We've ultimately spoken about a complexity of full body involvement in this situation, right? And I think that the world of modern healthcare is going there. We do now get it. The NHS is going to struggle to keep up with that. But certainly if people are listening to previous episodes, they'll get this message from a number of people that it's complex. But if we think of it as this full body system, this holistic approach to health, you're much more likely to hit the right things and cover the right health topics. And what it also seems is that testing for these things is going to be really effective. If you've got any doubt about it, you've tried a few things yourself, but you're still not quite feeling right, it seems like testing might be a pretty good way to find out some more information. So what does that look like?
So I use a lot of testing in my practice. There's a comprehensive hormone test that I use, which looks at estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, your stress response as well, so your 24-hour cortisol pattern, your DHEA, and the breakdown pathways as well of the estrogen and the progesterone and the testosterone. So for endometriosis, for example, and fibroids, looking at the estrogen detox pathways can be really, really helpful to get those best bang for your buck interventions.
Yeah.
That's not something that is currently available on the NHS, or there is no medical kind of lens on that at the moment. I also look at microbiome testing to see whether that could be influencing somebody's mood, their pain symptoms, and the gut microbiome is what I look at predominantly. But you can also look at the vaginal microbiome. So there's people who, for fertility reasons, they might want to look at it, but also if there's someone who keeps getting certain issues like UTIs or, like vaginal infections, looking at the vaginal microbiome. We've also got testing for the oral microbiome, because there's a huge impact of the oral microbiome on the gut as well. So a lot of people, when they're very stressed, will not produce enough stomach acid. But stomach acid also keeps us safe from anything that we're ingesting.
Yes.
And there's bacteria that are a normal part of the oral microbiome. But if our stomach acid is low and they start to settle in the gut because we've swallowed it through our spit, it can start to cause problems. So often people are like, I don't understand how I got here. I've never had a parasite. I've never had this. I've never had that. But there's things, there's certain things in tap water or whatever that could be influencing. So yeah, it's interesting to consider all the microbiomes. And then look at blood testing as well. So that looks at thyroid health and whether we're running low on any nutrients and that kind of thing. And the benefit of testing is that it makes it a lot easier to prioritize. What are the first things we need to get in place before we, get to the other things? And often people come to me and they're like, I want to know what supplement I can take for this. One, we need to figure out your lifestyle stuff first. You cannot out-supplement a bad diet. You can't out-supplement your stress. You cannot biohack your way out of, a lot of issues. And so that's where testing can be really helpful, because it's on paper what's happening in your body. There's a lot we can do without testing as well. And also, testing is not cheap.
Yeah.
So what I also have is a document that if you're going to the GP for hormone testing, for example, it's making sure that you're going at the right time of your cycle. So looking at your progesterone peak is going to be a certain time after you ovulate, so looking for certain signs. But also if someone comes to me with test results, and it's looking at, say, estrogen, FSH, LH, what day of your cycle did you do that on? So things that are completely free that we can do are track our cycle, like learn how to do that properly.
There's lots of apps out there for that. My wife uses one.
Loads of apps, exactly. So tracking your cycle, starting to see, are there certain symptoms that always come at at certain times? And that's any symptom. So, people with eczema and psoriasis will often notice flare-ups just before their period. That's because we're in a really inflammatory state. But if you are noticing significant flare-ups, then that signifies there's something, going on that's outside of the norm. So normally I say if your symptoms are impacting everyday life, that is a problem.
Yeah. I think a lot of people just put up with it, don't they?
Yeah, they do. People often will fill out the questionnaire that I send them and say, I didn't know that this was a symptom. I just thought it was something that happens to me every day, that it's normal. Yeah. So, yeah. And
I think, we've spoken a few times on this podcast about if you're not testing, you're guessing. But actually what it sounds like is in a bit more of a nuance to that. If you're not testing, you're guessing, but guessing's better than doing nothing.
100%. Yeah.
So that might be where you're saying like financially it's too much for me to spend all this cash. But just try something, test, retest, see what happens in your body. How do you feel?
Yeah, there's a caveat to testing, or guessing is better than nothing, which is don't experiment with loads of supplements, especially at the same time.
Yeah.
So there's a few like really wonderful supplements that can't do much harm, but there are always people who will have an impact that is not desired. And so it's really important to remember with supplements, dosing is really important. The quality of the supplement is really important, and making sure that your GP knows that you're on any supplements. So especially, for example, I had a client who had to have, she didn't have to have surgery in the end, but she thought she was going to have surgery. And if you're taking loads of fish oil, for example, technically that's healthy. But fish oil functions as a blood thinner, and so it's something you need to stop a few weeks before surgery because you don't want anything that's going to slow clotting down, for example.
Okay. Yeah.
But we don't think about that necessarily. So that's an example of, with supplements, it is worth getting like some good support from someone who knows what they're talking about.
And speaking of people who know what they're talking about, can you tell our listeners a bit about you and how, if someone's interested in you and they like what you're saying, they recognise some of those symptoms in themselves, how do they find you? So
where can you find me? That's a good question.
Other than here, until
I never
central
leave.
London. Yeah.
I actually sleep here. No, that's not true. I have a website. So my website is www.hormoniously.com. You can find me on Instagram at hormoniously. And as you mentioned, Charlie, I do a free 30-minute call that is just an opportunity to tell me about your symptoms and for me to ask probably incredibly probing questions about your health. But also it's an opportunity for me to signpost who might be helpful to speak to if I'm not the best person to help. Yeah. So you can book that. There's a link on my Instagram, but you can also book it through the website.
Thanks so much. And this is probably one of the episodes that my wife will listen to. She hates podcasts and she says I've got a boring voice and all of this. But I think this is one that she'll listen to, and I'm sure she'll share it with all her friends. So thanks so much for coming on. I think it's such an important topic that we speak about.
Thanks so much for having me. And thanks for having this conversation in a broader forum. I think it's so important.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Better, provider of health, wellness and performance services based in central London. You can book in for face-to-face services at either of our 2 clinics, one in Soho and one in the city. You can also follow us on Instagram at Better Never Ends, or head over to our website for more information about the clinics or the podcast at www.betterneverends.com. And of course, if you want to send us an email with any feedback, questions or suggestions for future episodes, then email us on podcast@betterneverends.com. And finally, thanks to Brian Long for editing the show. Without him, it's absolutely no doubt in my mind that these would never have seen the light of day. And it will allow this podcast to continue on for as long as I'll keep recording them. So thanks very much, Brian.